So today I'm going to kind of follow Caroline's lead and kind of just introduce folks to corridor planning and what we do, give you a little insight into what's happening and what's sort of driving our efforts and where we're headed. And you've seen this before. This is the strategic statewide corridor planning process. And so I wanted to bring this up just to kind of show you where corridor planning fits in. And basically, we're sort of wedged in between the long-range planning, what you heard Michelle talk about, and where we start to program our projects. So we're sort of in between long-range planning and programming. And basically, we are looking at data and information to enhance the transportation decision-making process. So another one of those tools that we can use to help select projects. What we do in corridor planning is we define transportation deficiencies, identify potential solutions, look at funding needs and how corridor improvements fit into larger system plans. We're analyzing traffic, engineering, environmental data, we're engaging stakeholders and the public, and then developing a plan or strategy to implement projects on corridors. So how do we decide, or what are some of the factors we consider when we're determining what corridors should be studied? Sometimes we're simply asked to look at a corridor from those above us, but typically we have some idea of certain conditions along our corridors that would necessitate some kind of study and coordination with districts. And so some of these factors could be areas where we have limited connectivity, congestion, high crash rates, policy, legislation could drive us to look at a corridor, economic development, so on and so forth. And so why is it important that we look at these corridors in Texas? Well, approximately 45 million people are projected to live in Texas by 2040, which is about a 69% increase. That is a lot of people. And we're experiencing congestion on our roadways right now. We're projected to continue to experience that congestion in the urban areas. And so it's important we keep looking and studying those priority corridors. Connectivity is also a big reason. We want to make sure we're connecting that population to economic centers. And then looking at safety, of course, which is a big goal, agency goal. We have some aging corridors, so we're looking at preservation when we're looking at our corridors and determining what projects may need to be done. We're not just looking at adding capacity, but also when we add capacity, do we need to do full reconstruction? So those are some of the things that we consider in corridor planning. And I want to mention freight because that's becoming more and more of a big issue, as we heard from Caroline. And so what are the corridor planning goals? We have agency goals, but we also have just some kind of internal goals for corridor planning as well. We're really focused on progressing the recommendations from the TTP 2040 plan, which is, a lot of that is looking and focusing on our high priority corridors, our interstates, the trunk system. Recently, we've been involved in revitalization of connectivity corridor network. So we'll continue to look at that. That's going to be an important thing coming up. We're identifying and analyzing the needs and potential projects on both rural and urban, so we're looking across the state. Analyzing projects for performance to make sure we've got that linkage between planning and programming. Like I said, our corridor plans are really, our ultimate goal is really to recommend and prioritize projects to move forward in the project development process. So it's going to be one of those tools that we use in conjunction with all the other plans that we're developing to really select the right projects. So when we decide we've got a corridor we need to look at, we've got 3 different approaches that we take. The first one is really just a high-level needs assessment, kind of feasibility. How does that corridor stand? Where does that corridor stand? What do we have? What kind of facility do we have? Do we have a 2-lane? Do we have a 4-lane? Are there safety issues? Are there pavement issues? Those kind of things. We're really just taking a high-level look. Then it can progress into a more detailed corridor route study. These definitely move beyond the needs assessment and really look for solutions, near-term, mid-term, long-term solutions. We're engaging the public typically, and depending on the corridor, we could be setting up working groups or just stakeholder groups, we're coordinating with the districts, really getting others involved. And then that leads to the last area, and that's implementation. And the ultimate, and that would be more like environmental and schematic development. And we also get somewhat involved in that. So the ultimate goal, though, is to put projects on the ground. So these implementation studies really kind of, line out projects that could be selected. And sometimes we're able to leverage and build upon each approach, moving from needs assessment to a more detailed corridor or route study to environmental schematic, and the lines get kind of squishy, so we may not do just a strict needs assessment. It may also morph into a corridor study. So, it's planning, so it just depends, right? So the next kind of thing I wanted to talk about is what corridor planning really enables us to do, and really we're able to outline a wide range of options for a particular corridor. And it could be the whole length of the corridor, it could be a segment of a corridor, but we can do this before we get into more expensive and extensive and detailed areas of project development. Having these things kind of fleshed out in corridor planning really helps facilitate the development of projects later on. We can ensure that near-term projects are part of a longer-term vision for a corridor, and it really is sometimes the first opportunity to really engage the public and stakeholders in having discussions about a particular corridor and what their plans and their vision for the corridor may be. And so what's driving our corridor planning? Well, we've got some key initiatives that I'm sure you've heard a little bit about. The first being congestion relief. We have the Texas Clear Lanes. So that's, congestion is definitely top of mind when we're doing our corridor studies, looking to reduce the congestion across the state. The next is connectivity. As I mentioned, that's going to become more prominent as we move forward in the year. And as funding is identified for those connectivity corridors. And then, the other initiative I wanted to mention again is the freight component, and especially incorporating recommendations from the freight plan. A lot of the corridors we study are also freight corridors, so it's really important that we collaborate and include those recommendations that Caroline's laid out in her plan. And then, of course, one of the things I wanted to mention too is one of the strategic goals for the agency, and that's deliver the right projects. And I feel like if there's any common thread in what we're discussing here today, it's that we are all set on delivering the right projects. So developing these implementation plans or development strategies that can be used as another decision-making tool by districts, by administration, it just supports evaluating, selecting, and prioritizing and selecting the right projects. But we have to consider too, just because a project's in a plan may not mean that that's the right project. Delivering the right project may mean determining that improvements thought to be needed are really not, or they may be needed later on. So that's part of the process too that we go through. So what have we accomplished in corridor planning? So I guess corridor planning really, this branch kind of really got going in 2013. There were some contracts that came out, and then in 2014. So really just for the past few years, we've been able to accomplish quite a bit. Since then, we've completed many corridor studies and plans, including development strategies for I-69 and I-35, and I-20 in East Texas, again, really focusing on the priority corridors. We also completed several needs assessments, route studies, we've prepared interstate designations, and I want to mention that we've also provided quite a bit of support to the districts for developing environmental and schematic for, basically over 25 projects. It's probably more now. It's probably more, yeah. Some of the projects identified in these studies and plans and efforts are moving forward to the next phases of development, and they're getting funded, so they're actually getting implemented, and I think that's important to mention. You know, our goal is definitely, we don't want these plans to sit on the shelf. We want these to be implementable. So I just wanted to touch on a few best practices that we've sort of, from our experience, sort of said, no, these are really good things that could help the process as we go forward, and it's things that we try to keep in mind when we do our work. One is using close coordination using a core team. And when we set up our corridor studies, usually we're including TPMP staff, but we're also including districts. We're including E&V staff. A lot of times we want that environmental perspective on potential impacts and so forth. And also public involvement. I think it's very important to get public involvement input early on in these corridor studies. We want to know what the folks along the corridor think, what their goals are, what their issues are. That helps provide some direction for us. The other thing I want to mention is that's important, a kind of a best practice, is careful review of your data. A lot of times you may find some anomalies or things that really just don't add up. And I think that it's important to identify those early on. You certainly don't want to get to your recommendations and have recommended the wrong thing based on data. It's important to have discussions with data providers so that they understand how you're using their data and basically just really put your assumptions down so that we know what to assume when we're looking at data and making decisions based off of it. And then we want to communicate our technical information as best we can using graphics. A lot of times we spend 12 to 18 months on a corridor study, and we've produced technical report after technical report. We have a lot of great data. We have this great big report, but that's probably not going to go anywhere if you're trying to get projects implemented. In our experience, it's best to try to display that with graphics and maps, executive summary, things that are really accessible to people that can only have a little bit of time to kind of digest what you've done and what your recommendations are. And then, again, keep in mind, we don't want it to sit on the shelf. We want it to be implementable, so it has to be accessible for people. So I know you can't really see a whole lot of detail on this map, but what I really wanted just to convey here is these are sort of all the corridors that we're studying right now. It's all across the state. It's rural. It's urban. We have a lot of things going on. And so here's just a quick list of some of the current studies that we have. It includes needs assessments. It includes corridor plans. One of the things we're looking at right now is the trunk system, which is quite a big effort, kind of hard to get your head around. We're looking at the entire trunk system for the state of Texas and really just assessing what we have, looking at the criteria, seeing if it needs to be refreshed, all those things. So, there's only 4 of us in the corridor planning branch, so you may be asking, well, how are you getting this all done? And luckily we have, as I mentioned before, we have 3 sets of consultant contracts that we're working from, and it has been wonderful to work with these great groups of people. So I guess the first contract was in 2013, as I mentioned. And then the second group came out in 2014 and then quickly realized, ooh, we need some more. So earlier this year, we executed 4 $10 million contracts. So that was our 3rd set right there. And overall, since 2013, approximately $170 million has been committed to corridor planning. So we've used quite a bit of that, actually. But we still have some more to go. But if I were a fortune teller and looking at a crystal ball, I would guess that we may have some more somewhere in the next couple of years coming out. But that's just me. So just looking ahead, what can you expect to see from corridor planning? Well, more, as we've heard throughout this, we're continuing to incorporate the moving toward the statewide performance-based planning and programming with metrics and prioritization, building. So we're going to continue to help build that foundation and be incorporating that into our quarter plans, using the prioritization and the metrics as much as possible in our quarter plans so that we're in alignment with everything that's going on in the agency. We will continue to assess the needs of our key corridors. That includes interstates and the connectivity corridors, using a data-driven approach. What you may see coming later this year, we've got a development strategy for I-35 and then also I-30 later this year. So that's just a couple of plans that are going to be coming out this year to look for. And then also, I wanted to mention that, we're doing this data-driven approach, but I think kind of Michelle touched on it a little bit, but we don't want to overlook the importance of still engaging our stakeholders and our public when we're selecting projects and really gauging their needs when we're going through this and not just looking at a particular number, making sure we're incorporating all the information. So with that, do I have any questions? Yes?
How do ports, waterways, and railroads factor into your work?
That's a great question. I mentioned we have a core team when we start our quarter plans, and so once we realize that we'll have any of those elements, we certainly will engage the rail division and the maritime to get their input for any of those issues. That's not our particular area of expertise, but we will engage them as soon as we discover that's what we're dealing with. Yeah, we really want to be sort of all-encompassing of all these initiatives, freight, rail, maritime. I mean, it's definitely a discussion when we set up our projects.
I should say I've been here a week and a half, director of the rail division. So.
Oh, nice to meet you. Look for an invitation later, maybe. Okay. Is there anything else? Okay, thank you.
I had a question.
Oh, sorry.
I'm not sure about the terminology, but is there a difference between a needs assessment and a full corridor study? What's the big distinction there?
Yeah, when we say needs assessment, we're really it's really kind of our first blush look at the corridor, just gathering the data that we have available, kind of doing a high-level assessment of what do we have, what might we need. For instance, I'll give you just kind of a for instance. Right now, we've just started a needs assessment for the US 190 corridor. So the FAST Act actually identified US 190 from I-10 to Louisiana, basically, as a high priority corridor. Okay, so we're looking at that now. And so what that means is they actually have identified that as I-14. Okay, so we're right now just assessing what do we have and what would it take possibly to bring that up to an interstate standard, because US 190 obviously is not to interstate standards. So that would be just sort of a first blush. If we went further with that, we would definitely start to engage the public. We'd take it down another level. We'd really look at some detail, maybe some conceptual engineering, that kind of.
One more question.
Yeah.
The critical rural freight corridors and the critical urban freight corridors that are outlined in the FAST Act, is your branch working on those? Or I know Caroline and you are working together, but who's working on designating those?
I'm gonna look at my boss. Oh.
Okay.
Not currently, but that's a great suggestion. We'll take a look at that.